story about a poor guy who died. Much to his surprise, he was sentenced not to heaven, but he was sent to Satan's domain. But before he was admitted, he was interviewed by Satan himself. The man said to Satan, he said, "It's pretty bad down here, isn't it?" "Not at all," said Satan. "You're surrounded by people who know how to enjoy. And each day we have a theme. Monday, for example, is party day. We party all day, around the clock. We party all day long on Monday. Tuesday is alcohol day. Open bar. All they want. There it is, free. Wednesday's tobacco day. The finest Havana cigars. All the best cigarette blends, whatever you like in tobacco, we got it. The guy begins to brighten up a little bit, and he says, "Well, I'm sold, let me in." They let him in the gate, and he promptly falls into a fiery pit where he's prodded by a nasty-looking thing with a pitchfork. "Hey," he said, "what happened to those theme days?" "Well, today's Thursday," Satan giggles with glee, "and on Thursday we tell lies." I guess if you expect Satan to tell you the truth, you're in for a rude surprise, huh? I want us to talk about hell just a little bit this morning. Not something I preach on a whole lot, but I want us to talk about it a little bit. According to a Harris poll that was taken some years back, more than 1/3 of adults worry a lot about not having enough money or health insurance. Now, I'm sure that's gone up about the health insurance by now. But fewer than 10% of the adults in America worry about that they will go to hell. In fact, while the majority of Americans believe in heaven and eventually expect to end up in heaven, studies show that most people today don't believe in hell. Our story for the day begins like this. Jesus comes to the region of Caesarea Philippi. The region of Caesarea Philippi, that's significant. Because Caesarea Philippi is on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, and it was the center of Baal worship. In fact, there were 14 different temples to the god Baal in Caesarea Philippi. 14. We often think that the only exposure to religious faith that the people of Jesus' time experienced was the Jewish faith, but that's not true. Far from true. Jesus was from Galilee. Galilee was a province in the northern part of Palestine, and there were still pockets of people who pursued other gods there in Galilee, in Jesus' hometown. Caesarea Philippi was one of those places that still included Baal worship. The entire land, of course, we know, was ruled by the Romans, so there was a common expression in that day and time to say Caesar is Lord. As a matter of fact, some of the Caesars demanded it. In other words, there were multiple gods that people could worship, both sacred gods and secular gods. And set in this context, this most famous of Jesus' questions takes on new meaning. He's asking the disciples to clarify their theology. Who do people say that the Son of Man is? His disciples replied, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist come back. Others say that you're Elijah come back. Others still others say you're Jeremiah come back. Or maybe one of the other prophets that they just can't get a handle on. And Jesus looks at the disciples and he says, what about you? Who do you say I am? And of course, we know it would be Simon Peter who blurts out, why, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Here we have, in the midst of the pagan gods of northern Palestine and the state god of Rome, there lived one who was Lord over all, and his name was Jesus. You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds with high praise for Peter. He says, hey, let me read it to you as it comes in the King James version of the Bible. I like this. He said, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed this unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Gates of hell. What does that suggest to you? That imagery of the gates of hell. To me it suggests the mighty gates of an evil empire. And an army is preparing to tear down those gates. Gates of hell. Gates of hell shall not prevail against my church. That's what Jesus said. You remember, most of you remember, I'm sure, a couple of you probably don't remember hearing him say it, but Ronald Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And they worked to get the Berlin Wall torn down. It came crumbling down. In the same way, Jesus is saying to us, there is an empire that is under attack today, and it is the empire of death and decay and all that is destructive in this world, and it is under attack by God's army, which is you, the church. Here's the promise. The gates of hell themselves, that mighty force that is the gates of hell, cannot stand against God's elect. The gates of hell will not be victorious against God's elect. The gates of hell will not prevail over the church. Jesus has said so. Pastor Wayne Cadero writes that he was once invited to take the helm of a battleship. Battleship's a big outfit. He said he stood on this massive ship and he looked out at all the sailors who were on the deck. Then an order came for all the sailors to assume their battle stations. And immediately the sailors were scurrying around all over the deck, and finally they all stood at their posts. Pastor Cadero said he looked at all those sailors as if he were the captain looking out over them. And he said he was amazed that each one knew exactly where they should be, and each one knew exactly what they should do, and each one knew exactly when they should do it. He said a few weeks later, he had the privilege and the pleasure of being on a ship again, but this time he was on a cruise ship. And as he walked around the different decks, he started thinking about the difference between his experience at the battleship and the cruise ship. Think about it for a moment. Think about the difference between the two. The battleship and the cruise ship. Battleship where everybody on it knows where they're supposed to be, what they're supposed to be doing, and when they're supposed to do it. And a cruise ship where everybody's there to be pampered and petted and get their way. There are a lot of church people who think the church is a cruise ship. But Christ calls us to be a battleship. There are people who think church is about having their own personal needs met, their needs for fellowship, for worship, for spiritual growth, and for comfort. And if that cruise ship that I call my church doesn't measure up, I'll just look for one that does. There are people who just simply come to church. And I want to tell you, there's a great deal of difference between coming to church and being the church. When you are the church, then you have a different attitude. Instead of looking at the church as a place where you can have your needs met, you begin to look at the church as a place where you can meet the needs of those for whom Christ died, where you can meet the needs for those who are oppressed, for those who hunger both physically and spiritually, for those who are lonely and those who are in pain. And suddenly your cruise ship becomes a battleship, and your enemies are all the forces of death and decay and destruction in the world. That's what we're about. Now I confess to you this morning, friends, that if you ask me to tell you what heaven's like, I can't tell you what heaven's like. If you ask me to tell you what hell's like, I can't tell you, describe it. Hell is separation from God. It may be a fire. It says it's a fire. It may be a fire. But it is eternal separation from God. That's bad enough for me. But I can tell you that I am glad because of Christ's sacrifice in my behalf. I don't have to worry about my eternal destination. But I do know that there are people in this community who are in torment today. There are people in this community whose pain never lets up. There are people in this community who have been in hell for many years and remain captive there today. And they are the people for whom the gospel is indeed great good news. And they are the people who need what we have to offer. John M. Buchanan was pastor of Fourth Presbyterian Church of Chicago years ago. He told a wonderful story about a lady named Elaine Pagels. Ms. Pagels was a distinguished professor at Princeton University. Princeton is a seminary there, and she was not a seminary professor. She was a humanities scholar. Somebody who studies and knows a lot about the human phenomena of religion. Her specialty was in early Christianity. And she was widely respected for her work and for her scholarly research and for the many books that she had written. She was not particularly a church person. In fact, she had pretty much given up on church as an institution that was worthy of her time and attention. She was above it, not unlike a lot of people. But she wrote a book entitled Beyond Belief. And she began that book with an unusual anecdote and a very powerful witness. She said it was a bright, cold morning on Sunday in New York City. She was going about her daily run, and it was so cold she stopped by a church and went into the vestibule to get warm. 2 days earlier, her 2.5-year-old son had been diagnosed with an invariably fatal lung disease. 2.5 years old. barely born, and already beginning to die. I can imagine the pain in her heart. I'm sure some of you can imagine the pain in her heart. Here's how she describes that scene in church that day. It's a Sunday, remember? She said, since I had not been in church for a long time, I was startled by my response to the worship that was in progress. The soaring harmonies of the choir singing with the congregation, and the priest, a woman in bright gold and white vestments, proclaiming the prayers in a clear, resonant voice. As I stood watching, a thought came to me. Here is a family that knows how to face death. The day after we heard Mark's diagnosis that he had but a few months to live, maybe a few years, a team of doctors had urged us to authorize a lung biopsy, a painful and invasive procedure. We asked how could it help. They explained that it couldn't help, but the procedure would let them see how far the disease had progressed. Mark, the child, was already exhausted by the previous day's ordeal, and holding him, I felt that if more masked strangers poked needles into him in an operating room, he might lose heart, literally, and die. We refused the biopsy. We gathered Mark's blanket, clothes, and Peter Rabbit, and carried him home. She writes, standing in the back of that church, I recognized uncomfortably that I needed to be there. That here was a place to weep without imposing tears upon a child. And here was a heterogeneous community that had gathered to sing, to celebrate, to acknowledge common needs, and to deal with what we cannot control or imagine. Some of you will understand this statement. Can there be a worse hell than to know that your child is dying? Where do you turn in times like that? We turn to God, and we turn to God's church. There are homeless people everywhere. There are homeless people in Gadsden. They're in every city in this country. Who's going to help them? The government throws up its hands in despair. Courts puts them back out on the street. Who's left to care about them? We turn to God. Only one group. The church is left to care about them. There are families outside these walls that are being torn apart for different reasons, for different things. There are young lives outside who are being shattered by drugs and alcohol abuse. There are old folks who are out there that nobody cares about. Who's responsible for these people? You and me. We are soldiers of the cross. Now, if you're here and you thought you bought a ticket for a cruise ship, you won't understand what I'm saying. Because you're waiting for the porter to come fluff the pillow, and I understand that. But others, probably all of you, do understand. You want your church to be a beacon to a sick and dying world. You want your church to make a difference. And that's why you're here, and that's why you serve in the ministries of the church, and that's why you give to support its causes. And I thank you for it. And I appreciate you. And I can never tell you the extent to which I appreciate you and your prayers, your And you will always have a very special place in my heart. But there are people outside who need to know it too. You need to know what you have to give. You need to experience what you have to give, what I've experienced. They need to experience it. In 1989, former President George Bush was entering St. John's Episcopal Church to attend a worship service. A homeless man, William Wallace Brown Jr., stopped him. He said, "Pray for me." The president's answer must have shocked those who heard him and those who were watching. The president replied, "No. Come inside with us and pray for yourself." From that day forward, William Wallace Brown Jr. was a regular attender of St. John's Episcopal Church. This man in ragged, smelly clothes sat in the pews alongside the rich and the powerful, and at offering time, he put $1 in the collection plate. One usher reports that many of the rich members also only gave $1 to the offering, and that many of those people were humbled by Mr. Brown's example of generosity. You know why William Wallace Brown was so generous, while so many of those wealthy churchmen were so stingy. You know. Because they thought they were on a cruise ship and they were tipping God. Not very well. But that's what they were doing. William Wallace Brown understood that he was on a battleship. His bigger resources, he wanted to do his part. I don't know what's coming. I don't know how it'll all work out. But I do know the gates of hell will not prevail against God's church. And that's who we are.